There is a woman at the center of Christianity's most important moment, and for almost 2,000 years, most of the world has been told the wrong story about her. She was not a prostitute. She was not a footnote. According to the very Gospels that every church on earth already accepts, she was the first human being to see Jesus alive after the crucifixion, and she was the one he personally sent to tell everyone else. That fact alone should make her one of the most famous names in religious history. Instead, her legacy was rewritten, and today, as Mel Gibson finally brings his long-awaited sequel to The Passion of the Christ to screen, one focused entirely on the resurrection, the question of who Mary Magdalene really was is becoming impossible to avoid. This is her real story, pieced together from the texts that survived, the ones that were buried, and the reasons both happened. Gibson's new film, now called The Resurrection of the Christ, has been in development for years. It recast the roles entirely, with a new actress stepping into the part of Mary Magdalene, and its entire plot centers on the 3 days between the crucifixion and the empty tomb. Naturally, that means Mary Magdalene is no longer a supporting character, standing at the edge of the frame. She is present at the single most important scene in the entire Christian story, the moment the tomb is found empty and Jesus appears. Any filmmaker adapting that scene has to grapple with an uncomfortable truth that most churchgoers were never taught in Sunday school. In the earliest layer of Christian tradition, Mary Magdalene was not a minor witness. She was the primary one. Start with what all 4 Gospels agree on, because this part is not controversial or fringe. It is simply the text as it has always existed. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John each describe Mary Magdalene going to the tomb on the first day of the week. She finds it empty. In John's Gospel, she is the first person the risen Jesus speaks to directly, and he gives her an instruction to go and tell the male disciples what she has seen. That makes her, in the plainest possible reading of the text, the first witness to the resurrection, and the first person commissioned to announce it. Early church writers even had a title for this. They called her the Apostle to the Apostles, because an apostle is simply someone sent with a message, and she was sent before any of the men who would go on to lead the church. So how did a figure with that kind of foundational role end up remembered in popular culture? As a repentant sex worker? The answer is a single decision made 5 centuries after the events themselves. In the year 591, Pope Gregory I delivered a homily in which he merged 3 separate women from the Gospels into one person, Mary Magdalene, an unnamed sinful woman from the Gospel of Luke, and Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus. There is no textual basis for this merger. The Gospels never say these are the same person. But Gregory's sermon became so influential in the Western Church that this composite figure, sinner, redeemed woman, faithful follower, became the default version of Mary Magdalene for the next 1400 years. It was not corrected in official Catholic teaching until 1969, when the Vatican quietly revised its liturgical calendar to separate the 3 women again. Most people never heard about the correction. The original mistake had already shaped centuries of art, sermons, and cultural memory. While Western Christianity was building and then slowly walking back that version of her, a different Christian tradition was preserving something closer to the original picture, largely because it developed outside of Rome's direct influence. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world, maintains a broader biblical canon than either Protestant or Catholic Bibles, incorporating additional texts such as the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees alongside the books every Christian already recognizes. Because Ethiopian Christianity formed its own theological identity early and stayed somewhat isolated from the doctrinal battles of Rome and Constantinople, it never had the same institutional pressure to minimize Mary Magdalene's role. In Ethiopian Orthodox liturgy, she continues to be honored explicitly using the ancient title, Apostle to the Apostles, without any of the later reputation that attached to her in the West. There is also a separate category of ancient writing that adds even more to this picture, even though none of it made it into any official Bible, Ethiopian or otherwise. In 1896, a fragmentary manuscript was discovered in Egypt containing a text now known as the Gospel of Mary, widely believed by scholars to refer to Mary Magdalene. dated by most historians to the 2nd century. It describes her receiving private teaching from Jesus and then explaining it to the male disciples after his death. In the surviving pages, the disciple Peter openly questions why Jesus would trust her with knowledge he did not give directly to the men. Another disciple, Levi, defends her, saying that if the Savior found her worthy, no one else has the standing to reject her. It is a remarkable scene because it shows that tension over her authority was not a modern invention. People in the earliest Christian communities were already arguing about whether a woman could hold that kind of position. A second text, the Gospel of Philip, likely written sometime in the 3rd century in Coptic Egypt, goes even further, describing Mary Magdalene as the companion closest to Jesus among all his followers, and noting that the other disciples resented the degree of affection and trust he showed her. Scholars caution against overreading this text romantically, since the word used for companion in that context likely carries a spiritual and communal meaning rather than a modern romantic one, and the manuscript itself is damaged in the exact section where the description appears, leaving real gaps that later popular retellings have sometimes filled in with speculation that goes beyond what the fragment actually supports. What both of these non-canonical texts consistently suggest, though, is that Mary Magdalene occupied a position of trust and instruction that made some of the male disciples uneasy, which lines up with the broader pattern historians see across early Christian sources. None of this is isolated to Mary Magdalene alone. The New Testament itself, in the very letters of Paul that the Western Church has always accepted, contains other women whose leadership roles were later obscured through translation choices rather than outright exclusion. In Romans chapter 16, Paul refers to a woman named Junia and describes her as outstanding among the apostles. For centuries, many translators quietly changed her name to the masculine form Eunice, apparently unable to accept that Paul was calling a woman an apostle, even though no manuscript evidence supports a male version of that name existing in the period. Modern textual scholarship has restored her correct identity as a woman, and most contemporary translations now reflect that. In the same chapter, Paul refers to a woman named Phoebe using the Greek word diakonos, a term meaning deacon or minister, which many English Bibles have historically softened into servant or helper, despite using the stronger term deacon when referring to men in nearly identical contexts. And in Acts and in Paul's letters, a woman named Priscilla is described teaching the eloquent preacher Apollos alongside her husband Aquila, with her name frequently listed first, an ordering scholars often point to as a signal that she may have been the more prominent teacher of the two. Taken together, this is not a conspiracy theory or a secret buried by any single villain. It is the documented record of how translation choices, institutional consolidation, and the theological politics of the 4th and 5th centuries, when the New Testament canon was being formally settled, gradually narrowed which voices were remembered as authoritative. As early Christianity moved from a scattered network of house churches into a centralized institution modeling itself partly on Roman administrative structures, leadership increasingly consolidated around male bishops, and texts or traditions that complicated that structure were less likely to be preserved, copied, or included when official canons were finalized. Historians describe this as a gradual institutional process shaped by real theological debates over authenticity and doctrine, not simply a cover-up, though the effect on how women like Mary Magdalene, Junia, Phoebe, and Priscilla were remembered was profound either way. This is also precisely why the timing of Gibson's new film matters for this conversation, even though nothing about his own personal research or beliefs is publicly documented on this specific question. A major, culturally significant film built entirely around the resurrection narrative cannot avoid putting Mary Magdalene back at the center of the story, simply because the text demands it. The gospel accounts do not allow her to be a background character in that scene. She is the one at the tomb. She is the one who sees him first. She is the one who is told to go and speak. Whatever creative choices the film ultimately makes, the underlying historical and textual reality is now unavoidable for a mainstream audience that has spent generations associating her name with an entirely different and largely inaccurate reputation. What emerges when you set aside centuries of accumulated assumption and go back to the earliest sources, is a woman who was present at the foundational moment of an entire world religion, trusted with the first announcement of its central claim, and later remembered by at least one major, ancient, unbroken Christian tradition using a title that placed her above the very apostles she was sent to inform. The reasons her story was simplified elsewhere are complicated, tied up in translation, theology, and the institutional needs of a growing church, rather than any single deliberate scheme. But the record that survives, in the canonical Gospels everyone already accepts, in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition that never let go of her original title, and in the fragmentary texts found in the Egyptian desert, tells a strikingly consistent story about a woman who mattered far more than she has been given credit for. It helps to understand just how different the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church's relationship to Scripture actually is, because it explains why this tradition preserved a different memory of Mary Magdalene in the first place. Christianity arrived in the Kingdom of Aksum, in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, in the 4th century, around the same era that Rome was formally adopting the religion under Constantine. From that point forward, Ethiopian Christianity developed its own liturgy, its own monastic tradition, and its own canon, largely independent of the councils and doctrinal fights that shaped the Latin-speaking and Greek-speaking churches. That independence is precisely why its Bible looks different today. Where a Protestant Bible contains 66 books and a Catholic Bible contains 73, the Ethiopian Orthodox canon includes over 80, incorporating texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees that were widely read in the earliest centuries of Christianity, but were eventually excluded elsewhere as the canon narrowed. None of these additional Ethiopian texts contain some hidden biography of Mary Magdalene waiting to be discovered. Her prominence in Ethiopian tradition comes primarily through liturgy and commentary built around the same canonical gospel accounts every other Christian already has, interpreted through a church that never absorbed the specific 4th and 5th century Western habit of collapsing her identity into that of a repentant sinner. That distinction matters because a lot of viral claims online exaggerate what the Ethiopian Bible actually contains, implying it holds some secret gospel chapter about her that the West suppressed. It does not. What it holds instead is an unbroken liturgical memory, an institution that simply never stopped calling her what the Gospel of John implies she was, the one who was sent. That is a subtler and in some ways more powerful point than a hidden document would be. It shows that the plain reading of the existing Gospels always supported her importance. It was Western tradition that added the distortion, not Ethiopian tradition that added a revelation. Returning to Rome in the 6th century helps explain how that distortion actually took hold. Pope Gregory I was not a fringe figure inventing an odd theory in isolation. He was one of the most influential popes in the Church's history, credited with reorganizing the liturgy, sending missionaries to convert England, and shaping medieval Catholic theology for centuries afterward. When a figure with that much institutional authority delivered a homily merging Mary Magdalene with the unnamed sinful woman of Luke chapter 7 and with Mary of Bethany, his interpretation did not stay confined to one sermon. It filtered into liturgical calendars, into devotional art, into the feast days assigned to her, and eventually into the popular imagination of an entire continent. By the time of the medieval mystery plays and later Renaissance paintings, the image of Mary Magdalene as a former prostitute weeping at the foot of the cross was so entrenched that most people had no idea it originated from a single interpretive choice rather than from Scripture itself. The correction, when it finally came, arrived quietly. In 1969, as part of a broader revision of the Catholic liturgical calendar following the Second Vatican Council, the Church formally separated the three women again, restoring Mary Magdalene's feast day to reflect only what the Gospels actually say about her, without the added identity of the sinful woman or Mary of Bethany. It was a meaningful correction, but it received nowhere near the cultural attention that centuries of the merged version had already generated. Popular culture, from stained glass windows to later films and novels, continued to draw on the older composite image long after the Church itself had walked it back. This is also where the conversation around Eunia, Phoebe, and Priscilla becomes relevant, because it shows that Mary Magdalene's case was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader and well-documented pattern in how women's roles were recorded, translated, and eventually softened over time. Eunice's case is especially striking because it did not require a theological argument at all, only a change in spelling. The Greek name in Romans 16 is grammatically ambiguous only in the sense that early manuscripts do not use accent marks the way later print editions do, but every reference to a masculine version of the name, Eunice, is otherwise unattested anywhere in surviving Greek literature from the period, while the feminine name Eunia was common. Despite that, for much of the medieval and early modern period, translators and commentators, evidently uncomfortable with Paul calling a woman outstanding among the apostles, rendered the name in its masculine form. Contemporary textual scholars, working from the earliest available manuscripts, have restored her as Eunia, and most modern translations, including recent editions of the New International Version and the New Revised Standard Version, now reflect that correction, along with accompanying footnotes explaining the history of th. change. Phoebe presents a slightly different kind of distortion, one rooted in translation philosophy rather than manuscript alteration. Paul refers to her in Romans 16 using the Greek word diakonos, the same root word used elsewhere in the New Testament for the office of deacon. When Paul uses that word to describe men in similar contexts, older English translations often rendered it as deacon or minister. When describing Phoebe, many of those same translations opted instead for softer terms like servant or helper, despite the underlying Greek being identical. Modern scholarship has increasingly pushed back on that inconsistency, and a number of contemporary translations now render her title as deacon, consistent with how the word is treated elsewhere in the text. Priscilla's story adds another layer, because in her case, nothing was mistranslated at all, only underemphasized. Acts of the Apostles and Paul's letters describe her and her husband Aquila instructing Apollos, a skilled and eloquent early Christian preacher, more accurately in the faith after hearing him teach something incomplete. What stands out to historians is that in several of these references, Priscilla's name appears before her husband's, an ordering convention in the ancient world that often, though not always, indicated the more prominent or socially significant figure in a pairing. Later church tradition largely moved on from this detail, emphasizing Apollos and Paul while treating Priscilla and Aquila as a supporting married couple rather than highlighting what the naming order might suggest about her individual standing as a teacher. None of this amounts to proof of some coordinated ancient plot to erase women from Christian history. Historians studying the 4th and 5th centuries generally describe something more mundane and in a way more believable. A young religious movement moving from a loose network of scattered communities toward a single, centralized institutional structure, borrowing organizational patterns from the surrounding Roman world as it went. Roman civic and religious life at the time was itself heavily male-dominated in its formal leadership structures, and as Christianity sought legitimacy and stability within that world, its own leadership increasingly mirrored those norms. Texts, translations, and traditions that fit comfortably within an emerging, male-led hierarchy were more likely to be copied, preserved, and eventually canonized. Those that complicated that structure were less likely to survive the process, not necessarily because of any single conspiracy, but because the ordinary mechanics of what gets copied, funded, and formally endorsed tend to favor whatever reinforces the status quo of the people doing the copying. Seen against that backdrop, Mel Gibson's new film becomes an interesting cultural test case rather than a revelation of secret information. The Passion of the Christ, when it was released in 2004, generated enormous debate over historical accuracy and depiction, and became one of the highest-grossing independent films ever made despite, or perhaps partly because of, that controversy. Its sequel, now split into 2 parts and years into production, shifts the story to the resurrection itself, a narrative event in which Mary Magdalene is not optional set dressing, but the central witness, according to the very Gospels the film draws from. Any faithful adaptation of that scene has to reckon with her role directly, whether or not the filmmakers intend to make any broader statement about her historical reputation. What audiences take away from that moment may end up depending less on any hidden ancient secret, and more on whether viewers already know the version of Mary Magdalene that the earliest texts actually describe. For centuries, most people absorbed a composite image built from a 6th century sermon rather than from the Gospels themselves. The correction to that image did not require a lost gospel or a dramatic discovery. It required going back to the plain text that Christians of every denomination already had in front of them the whole time, and to the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition that never stopped reading it that way. 2,000 years later, as a new generation encounters her story, maybe through a film, maybe through a Bible study, maybe through a conversation like this one, the title the earliest tradition gave her is finally getting a wider hearing again. Apostle to the Apostles. First witness. The one who was sent. Not a footnote in someone else's story, but the person standing at the very beginning of the most consequential claim in Christian history.